I am 34 years old, and last year my wife and I moved into an old house in rural Vermont, in a small town near Montpelier. The house dates back to the 1940s, one of those places that has been renovated a few times but still keeps a lot of the original structure. We left Burlington because we wanted something quieter, less noise, and we found this house at a price that was too good to ignore. I work remotely in IT, and she's a nurse at the local hospital, so it made sense. When we moved in, we were still in that excited phase, unpacking boxes, replacing a few old things, doing small repairs ourselves. Nothing structural, just simple stuff like old outlets, yellowed light switches, that kind of thing. The house seemed solid, firm wooden floors, nothing creaking beyond normal. The attic was small, accessed by a pull-down ladder in the hallway, but we barely went up there because it was just old insulation and dust. At first, nothing seemed unusual. At least that's what I thought. That particular night, I was replacing an outlet in the guest bedroom upstairs, under the most slanted part of the roof. It was winter, and it was already dark outside by around 5 in the evening. The heater was running, that constant sound of air moving through the ducts, and my wife was downstairs in the kitchen making dinner. When I removed the outlet plate, I noticed the screw was slightly loose and the electrical box seemed deeper than normal. When I pulled the outlet out a little, I felt no resistance behind it. It wasn't the usual tight space with wiring and wood. It felt empty. I used my phone's flashlight and shined it inside, expecting to see beams and wires. But the beam of light just disappeared into darkness. It was too deep to be just plumbing space. I moved the phone slowly, adjusting the angle, and that's when I saw something that didn't look right. The insulation was compressed, marked, as if someone had pressed their body against it repeatedly. At first, I thought it might be from some old renovation, but the marks looked too recent, like someone had leaned there on purpose. I stayed there for a few seconds, phone pointed into that void, trying to process what I was seeing. The flash reflected off the fiberglass insulation, and it was clear it wasn't just random sagging. There was a pattern, like someone had put their weight against that wall multiple times. I even reached my arm through the opening as far as I could, but I felt nothing except cold air. Too cold, actually. It was strange because the heating was on and the rest of the room was comfortable. But from inside that space, there was a steady draft of cold air. It didn't smell strongly of mold or anything specific, just that dry scent of old dust mixed with something more recent, like plastic. I called my wife's name, asking if she knew whether anyone had worked on that wall before. She answered from downstairs that she had no idea. The house had been renovated before the sale, but according to the realtor, nothing structural had been altered. I couldn't let it go. Instead of just putting the outlet back and forgetting it, I grabbed a screwdriver and started widening the drywall opening just enough to see better. The plaster came off too easily, like it had already been disturbed before. When I made the opening larger and stuck my phone inside again, I finally realized it wasn't just a gap between beams. It was a long, narrow space, like a corridor between two parallel walls. I slowly moved the light left and then right, and the beam illuminated something on the floor of that space. It took me a few seconds to identify it because it was partially covered in dust, but when I adjusted the focus, I saw clearly a black flashlight lying on its side, and a few inches beyond it, a clear plastic water bottle, slightly crushed. It didn't look old. It wasn't covered in cobwebs or heavily coated in dirt. It looked like it had been left there recently. At that moment, I felt a knot in my stomach I couldn't explain. Because for someone to leave those things there, they would have had to enter that space somehow. And I had no idea how that would be possible without breaking the wall. I knelt on the bedroom floor for a while, just staring at that opening in the wall, trying to come up with a logical explanation. My first thought was that maybe a contractor had left it during renovations. Maybe someone had opened the wall to run wiring and accidentally dropped something. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. The flashlight was intact, it didn't look like it had fallen accidentally. And the bottle was positioned strangely, lying almost parallel to the wall as if someone had placed it there deliberately. I called my wife again and asked her to come upstairs. When she saw the size of the hole in the wall, she immediately asked what I was doing. I showed her inside with my phone. She went quiet for a few seconds, then asked if it was some kind of technical crawl space. I told her I had never seen anything like that on any blueprint, and that the gap was too wide to be just insulation. We went downstairs and grabbed the folder with the house documents the realtor had given us. We spread the blueprints across the kitchen table while dinner went cold. The only sounds were the low hum of the heater and the wind lightly hitting the windows. I started comparing the bedroom's measurements with the floor plan. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The external width of the house in that section didn't match the interior measurements of the bedroom and hallway next to it. There was a small discrepancy, but enough to fit exactly that kind of narrow space between walls. And nowhere on the plans was there any mention of a technical corridor or access there. It was as if that gap officially didn't exist. My wife suggested it could be an old measurement error, something common in older houses, but all I could think about was the flashlight and the fact that someone would have needed a way in. I went back upstairs alone while she stayed downstairs trying to call a friend who worked in construction. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. The upstairs hallway felt quieter than usual, as if the heater had softened, even though I knew that was just my imagination. When I re-entered the guest bedroom, the air felt colder near the exposed wall. I knelt again and shined my phone inside, moving the light slowly, trying to see how far the space extended. The beam revealed only a narrow corridor, raw wood on both sides, insulation and dust covering the floor. But as I moved the light, I realized it didn't end there. It continued to the right, toward the attic. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. At first, nothing. Then I thought I heard something faint, like a very subtle dragging sound, almost like fabric brushing against wood. I held my breath to listen more carefully. The sound stopped. I tried to convince myself it could be wind causing the structure to shift. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. Still, my heart was beating faster than it should have. I went into the hallway, pulled down the attic ladder, and climbed up with my phone in hand. Up there it was cramped, just beams, old insulation, and that strong smell of heated dust. The flashlight beam lit up particles in the air. I carefully stepped across the beams, feeling the wood solid beneath my feet. I looked around for any sign of recent disturbance, removed panels, anything out of place. Nothing seemed touched. The insulation looked intact. There was no obvious passage leading into that hidden wall space. While I stood there trying to make sense of it, I heard it again. Not in the attic, below me. A short, muffled sound like a small impact against wood, coming directly from the direction of the guest bedroom where I had opened the wall. My stomach went cold instantly. I climbed down from the attic faster than I'd like to admit, nearly slipping on the pull-down ladder because my hands were sweating despite the cold. When I reached the hallway, I stood still, listening. The house was too silent. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint sound of the TV downstairs and the wind brushing against the side of the house. I entered the guest bedroom slowly. The hole in the wall was exactly as I had left it. I knelt again and aimed my phone inside. For a few seconds, nothing looked different. The flashlight was still there. The bottle, too. But then I noticed something that made me freeze. The bottle wasn't in exactly the same position. I remembered it leaning slightly left, resting against the insulation. Now it was more upright, like it had rolled a few inches. I tried to convince myself I must have misremembered. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that something had changed. I called my wife upstairs immediately. I explained the sound I had heard in the attic. She went pale but tried to stay calm, suggesting maybe the bottle had rolled due to vibration from the heating system or wind. That was possible. Old houses vibrate. But something felt wrong. Then I heard it again. A faint sound from inside the space. Not loud, almost like controlled breathing, very low, interrupted by a light brush. My wife grabbed my arm tightly and whispered for us to get out of there. And for the first time that night, I was certain it wasn't just the house settling. We left the room quietly and went downstairs. I called 911 and told them we believed someone might be inside the structure of the house. While we waited, we stood in the kitchen near the back door in case we needed to leave quickly. I turned off the TV to hear better. The silence felt suffocating. At one point, we heard a sound upstairs. Slow weight shifting on wood, a restrained step, then another. When I finished turning the car and lined up with the exit road, the flashlight in the path was still standing in the exact same place in the middle of the fog. I began driving slowly toward the exit. Visibility was very poor, so I didn't want to accelerate too much and end up sliding off the dirt road. As the car moved forward, that flashlight got closer and closer. I was trying to look through the fog to see if I could distinguish a person there, some movement, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing. Only the beam of light illuminating the ground. When I got within a few meters, the light moved for the first time. It wasn't a sudden movement. It simply slid a few steps to the side, slowly leaving the middle of the road and moving into the low vegetation along the edge. Even then, I didn't see anyone. No clear silhouette, no body, just the flashlight moving out of the way as if it were opening a path. I didn't stop at any point. I drove straight past and continued along the small road until I reached the main road that led back to the highway. My heart was still racing and my hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly. When I finally reached the paved road, I felt a certain relief, like I was leaving a place I shouldn't have been. But out of curiosity or maybe nervousness, I looked in the rearview mirror while I was still near the entrance to the park. The fog still covered almost everything, but for a few seconds I could see the parking area between the trees. And that was when something gave me a real chill. All of those flashlights that had been spread throughout the forest turned off at exactly the same time. Not one by one, all at once, as if someone had given a signal. Story 2. I am 21 years old and I live in a small coastal town in Oregon called Florence. It's one of those very quiet towns, with only a few main streets, many businesses closing early, and that constant damp atmosphere because of the ocean. At the time, I was in my second year of community college and working part-time at a small cafe near downtown. My shift usually ended around 10:30 at night, and since I didn't have a car at the time, I depended on the last bus on the route that passed near there. That bus usually came around 11:10. The bus stop was on an avenue that has some movement during the day, but at night it becomes practically empty, especially when the ocean fog starts to roll in, which happens often after 11 at night. On that specific night, the fog was much heavier than usual. I remember leaving the cafe, closing the door behind me, and already feeling that salty ocean air mixed with the damp cold. The streetlights barely illuminated the road because the mist scattered the light and made everything look dim. The bus stop was about a 3-minute walk from there, a simple glass shelter with a metal bench inside. When I arrived, the street was completely empty. No cars passing, no pedestrians, nothing. Just the distant sound of waves and the faint noise of wind coming from the direction of the beach. I sat on the bench, pulled my coat tighter, and stared at my phone while waiting for the bus to appear. After a few minutes, I lifted my eyes from the phone and glanced across the street almost without thinking. That was when I noticed a silhouette standing on the opposite sidewalk. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting to cross the street, or maybe another person waiting for the bus at a different stop. The lighting there was weak and the fog blurred everything, so it was hard to see details. It was just the shape of a person standing there, facing roughly toward the street. The strange thing was that the figure didn't seem to move, no steps, no gestures, nothing. I watched for a few seconds trying to figure out if it was really a person, or just something that looked like one because of the fog. I kept glancing in that direction while checking the time on my phone. The bus would still take a few minutes. The silhouette remained in the same spot. It didn't cross the street, didn't walk, didn't move its arms, just standing there in the fog. That started to make me a little uncomfortable, because normally when someone is waiting for a bus or walking down the street, they at least shift a little, check their phone or pace around. But that figure seemed completely still. After a few more minutes, I looked again and it wasn't there anymore. The sidewalk across the street was empty, as if no one had ever been standing there. At first, I thought the person had simply left while I was looking at my phone. It wasn't a big deal. Even so, I stared a little longer in that direction, trying to see if someone was walking along the sidewalk. The fog was so thick that after about 20 meters you could barely see anything. The streetlights turned into nothing more than a diffused glow in the middle of the white haze. I spent a few seconds looking across the street, trying to spot any movement. Nothing. The street remained completely silent and empty. That was when I heard a very faint sound behind me. It wasn't a loud step. It was more like the sound of someone stepping slowly on the wet concrete of the sidewalk. The kind of sound you only notice when everything around you is completely silent. I turned my head instinctively, looking behind the bus shelter. And there, just a few meters away, partially hidden by the fog behind the glass of the shelter, was another silhouette. A person standing directly behind the structure of the bus stop. completely still. I am absolutely certain that no one had been there just a few seconds earlier. At that moment, I felt that kind of alertness that comes without you fully understanding why. My first thought was that it might be the same person who had been across the street and had crossed while I was distracted, but even trying to think that way, something didn't seem to fit. I hadn't heard any sound of someone crossing the street. No braking cars, nothing. And if someone had walked over normally, I probably would have seen the movement out of the corner of my eye. But that person was simply there now, standing behind the glass shelter as if they had been there for some time. I stayed seated, trying to act like I hadn't noticed. I picked up my phone and looked at the screen, but all of my attention was focused on the presence behind me. Through the faint reflection in the side glass of the shelter, I could see part of the silhouette. It looked like someone of average height, maybe wearing a longer coat. What bothered me most was that they didn't move either. No steps, no breathing sounds, no movement of hands or head, just standing there. After a few seconds, that feeling of being trapped started growing in my mind. I sat there for maybe another minute trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to simply start walking to the next street and wait for the bus at another stop. It wasn't very far. But to do that, I would have to pass along the side of the shelter, practically right next to the person standing behind me. That made me even more uncomfortable. So I thought about crossing the street and waiting on the other side instead. At least that would put some distance between me and that silhouette. I slowly stood up from the bench, trying not to make much noise, and stepped out of the shelter. When I took my first steps toward the street, I quickly glanced out of the corner of my eye behind the shelter. The silhouette was still there, standing in the exact same place. It didn't say anything. It didn't try to approach. It didn't even seem to react when I left the stop. That made me even more nervous. I crossed the street quickly, looking both ways even though almost no cars passed at that hour. The fog made everything feel quieter than usual. When I reached the sidewalk on the other side, I breathed a little easier and started walking a few meters away from the bus stop. I had walked maybe 15 or 20 meters when I lifted my eyes and stopped immediately. Farther ahead on the same sidewalk, there was another person standing, just like the other silhouettes I had seen. This one was also completely still inside the fog. The light from a street lamp right behind them cast a long shadow across the wet sidewalk. For a few seconds, I just stared, trying to understand if it was someone waiting for the bus at another stop or if they had just arrived there. But the position was strange. It wasn't exactly a bus stop. It was just a normal stretch of sidewalk in front of a closed commercial building. My stomach tightened at that moment because the situation began to feel wrong in a way I couldn't fully explain. I quickly looked back toward the bus shelter. The fog made it hard to see clearly, but I could still make out the dark shape of the glass structure, and the silhouette behind it was still there. Which meant that now I had one person standing behind me on the other side of the street, and another standing a few meters ahead on the same sidewalk where I was. Neither of them seemed to move. Neither said anything. Neither appeared to be using a phone or doing anything normal that someone waiting for a bus would do. At that moment, I felt a very clear sense that I needed to leave. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was that instinctive feeling that something was not right. I stopped walking for a second, trying to decide where to go. Going back to the bus stop meant passing closer to the person behind the shelter. Continuing forward meant getting closer to the silhouette standing farther down the sidewalk. I stood there in the middle of the street for a few seconds, looking both ways. Both figures remained completely motionless inside the fog, as if they were simply waiting. And that was exactly when I heard the sound I most wanted to hear at that moment, the distant rumble of a heavy engine coming down the avenue. I immediately turned my head toward the curve in the street and saw two large headlights slowly appearing through the fog. It was the bus. I didn't hesitate. I crossed the street almost running and went straight back to the bus stop. As I walked quickly, I tried not to look directly at the silhouette behind the shelter, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that it was still there, standing exactly in the same place. The bus stopped with that loud air brake sound, which in that silent street felt even stronger. The doors opened and I got on almost instantly, barely looking back. The driver greeted me quickly and I tapped my card with a hand that was still slightly shaking. Inside the bus, there were only two other people sitting farther toward the back. I went straight to one of the first seats near the window, still trying to catch my breath. Only after I sat down did I dare to look outside. The fog still covered most of the street, but I could see the bus stop where I had been just seconds earlier. The glass structure appeared like a dark shadow beneath the streetlight. That was when I saw movement. The two silhouettes began to walk. The one that had been behind the shelter slowly stepped out of the fog and onto the sidewalk. At the same time, the one farther down the street also began to walk. Both moved slowly, one coming from each side of the street, converging exactly toward the bus stop where I had been just moments earlier. Neither of them ran. Neither seemed rushed. They simply walked toward the stop as if approaching from both sides at the same time. The bus began to pull away and the fog slowly swallowed the two figures until they completely disappeared from my view. Story 3. I have been driving trucks for about 15 years. At the time this happened, I was doing regional routes through the South, mainly Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. It was a small refrigerated food transport company, so I usually drove during the early morning hours to avoid traffic and meet delivery schedules. That particular night, I was hauling a load of frozen products from Jackson to a smaller town near the Alabama border. It was a route I had done a few times before. Part of the drive involved crossing a long bridge over a wide river in rural Mississippi. It's not a very famous bridge, but it's one of those that seems to never end when you're driving across it at night. And that morning the fog was really heavy. I remember entering the bridge around 3 in the morning. The fog was coming off the river and covering everything. Visibility was poor, maybe 30 or 40 meters at most. The truck's lights reflected off the mist and made everything look white, like I was driving inside a low cloud. The bridge had 2 lanes and a narrow shoulder on both sides, with those low metal guardrails separating the road from the river far below. I was driving slowly and paying close attention, because in that kind of fog anything can suddenly appear in front of the truck. That was when I started to see a dark shape appearing on the shoulder a few meters ahead. As I got closer, I could see it was a car parked on the shoulder of the bridge. A dark sedan, maybe gray or black, though it was hard to tell with that lighting and the fog spreading everything out. What immediately caught my attention was that the car was completely dark. No headlights, no hazard lights, nothing. Just sitting there in the middle of the bridge, which by itself is already strange, because almost nobody stops on a long bridge in the middle of the night. As I approached, I noticed something else. There was someone standing next to the car. The man was standing near the driver's door, facing roughly toward the road. He wasn't working on the car, wasn't talking on the phone, wasn't waving for help. He was just standing there. When my truck got closer, I naturally paid more attention, expecting some kind of reaction. Normally, when a big truck passes that close, people at least look over or step back because of the wind. But that man did absolutely nothing. He didn't raise his hand, didn't turn his head, didn't move even a centimeter. He simply stood there as I drove past. When I passed beside him, I could see a little better in the truck's lights. He looked like an adult man, maybe 40 or 50 years old, wearing a dark jacket. His face was somewhat turned toward the road, but it was still hard to see details because of the fog and the speed of the truck. What stuck with me the most was his posture. It was rigid, arms at his sides, body completely still. He didn't look like someone checking the engine or trying to signal for help. He looked like someone simply waiting. I remember thinking for a second about stopping farther ahead to see if he needed help, because stopping in the middle of a bridge with the car completely dark isn't exactly normal. But a loaded truck doesn't stop easily on a narrow bridge, so I kept driving. A few seconds after passing the car, I took that automatic look in the left side mirror, more out of habit than anything else. Through the fog, I could still see part of the bridge behind me. That's when I noticed something else that immediately made me frown. Farther ahead, near the other side of the bridge, there was another figure standing. It also looked like a man. He was standing near the side railing of the bridge a few meters before the exit. At that moment, I tried to make sense of it. The first thing I thought was that maybe it was another person who had stopped there for some reason. But the distance didn't make sense. I had just passed the car with the man standing beside it in the middle of the bridge maybe 10 seconds earlier. The bridge was long, and that other figure was almost at the exit on the other side. There simply wasn't enough time for someone to leave the car, walk quickly across that entire distance, and appear there ahead. Even so, I kept driving, occasionally looking through the windshield trying to see better through the fog. As I got closer to the end of the bridge, the silhouette became a little clearer. It really was a man standing near the railing, with his body facing the river as if he were looking down. Just like the other one, he also wasn't moving. He didn't appear to be walking, didn't seem to be using a phone, nothing. Just standing there. When my truck passed him, the same thing happened. No reaction, no glance. He didn't even turn his head at the sound of the truck engine passing so close. At that point, it was starting to make me uncomfortable in a way that was hard to explain. When I finally exited the bridge, I felt that automatic sense of relief that every truck driver feels when finishing a long crossing in heavy fog. The road continued straight for a short distance before entering a gentle curve to the right. I kept my speed low because the visibility was still poor. As I drove, I started thinking again about the car stopped in the middle of the bridge. It didn't seem safe. A vehicle stopped there, completely dark, could easily cause an accident if another driver suddenly appeared in the fog. I seriously considered calling it in on the radio, or even contacting highway patrol once I reached better signal. That was when I saw something that made my stomach tighten instantly. A few meters ahead on the shoulder just after the bridge exit, there was a car parked. Its lights were also off. And even before I got fully close to it, I recognized the shape of the vehicle. It was the same dark sedan I had just seen parked in the middle of the bridge seconds earlier. I'm sure of it. Same model, same trunk shape, same dark color muted by the fog. Now it was parked just after the bridge as if it had somehow passed me at some point, which simply wasn't possible on that narrow road. My first thought was that maybe I was confusing the cars. At night with fog, many vehicles can look the same. But as I got closer, I noticed a detail I had briefly seen when I passed it on the bridge. The rear bumper had a scrape on the left side as if it had rubbed against something. The car parked at the end of the bridge had the exact same scrape in the exact same spot. That gave me a cold feeling in my stomach. I knew it was the same car. There was no way it was a coincidence. As my truck slowly passed it, I automatically looked for the man who had been standing next to the vehicle in the middle of the bridge. But there was no one there now. No person near the car, no open door, nothing. Just the vehicle parked on the shoulder, completely dark, exactly the way it had been minutes earlier. The road along that stretch was straight for a long distance. There was no other entrance, no other lane, nothing that would allow a car to leave the bridge, pass a loaded truck, and stop there without me noticing. I kept driving for several more miles after that, but I kept checking my mirrors constantly, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me. Nothing ever did. The road remained empty for a long time, and to this day I still can't explain how that car left the middle of the bridge and appeared ahead of it, without ever passing me. And the strangest thing of all is that I never saw either of those two men again. Story 4. I live in Rochester, Minnesota, and I've always liked camping whenever I have a few free days. I'm not an expert or anything, but I enjoy getting in the car, driving a few hours, and setting up a tent near a lake or in more open rural areas. At the beginning of last fall, 3 friends and I decided to take a quick weekend camping trip near a small lake in the countryside of the state, in an area of public land where camping is allowed. It's not exactly a structured park. It's more like an open field surrounded by trees, with the lake right next to it. We arrived there late on a Saturday afternoon. The place was completely empty, with no other cars or tents nearby. The plan was simple: set up the tents, make a small campfire, do a little fishing the next day, and head home on Sunday. The weather was the typical early fall cold, around 6 or 7 degrees Celsius at night. The field was large and open, covered in low grass that was already a bit damp because of the weather. We set up 3 tents close to each other and kept the campfire a few meters away from them. After eating something and talking for a while, everyone gradually went to sleep. I went to bed around midnight. Before getting into the tent, I remember looking around and noticing that the field was completely silent. No wind, no distant cars, no other campsite visible anywhere. The only thing you could hear was the faint sound of the lake water and a few insects in the grass farther away. At that time, there was no fog at all. I woke up in the middle of the night without knowing exactly why. It took me a few seconds to understand where I was because inside the tent it was completely dark and quiet. That was when I realized the air felt different. It was colder and more humid. When I pulled the zipper of the tent open slightly to look outside, I saw that the entire field had been covered by very dense fog. It wasn't that light mist that stays low to the ground. It was thick fog, the kind that makes things disappear just a few meters away. The faint glow of the campfire, which was almost out, turned into nothing more than a diffused light inside the fog. While I was looking outside trying to understand how bad the visibility had become, I heard a sound coming from the grass near the tents. It was very light but very clear. Footsteps. The kind of sound that happens when someone walks slowly on wet grass. At first I heard 2 or 3 short steps, then silence. I stayed still, trying to listen more carefully. A few seconds later, the sound came back, this time from a different point around the campsite, as if someone were slowly walking around the tents. At first, I thought it might be one of my friends who had stepped out of the tent to go into the woods or toward the lake. That happens a lot when you're camping, but after a few seconds, I realized something didn't add up. The footsteps didn't seem to be going in a straight line anywhere. They seemed to be moving around the tents. A few meters on one side, then a few steps somewhere else. Always on the wet grass, always slow. I stayed inside the tent trying to hear if someone said something or called out to anyone. But there were no voices. After a few more seconds, I heard a zipper opening in the tent next to mine. It was Mark, one of my friends. He spoke quietly outside, almost whispering, asking if anyone else was awake. I said yes. He asked if I was hearing it too. Before I even answered, the footsteps happened again. This time very close, maybe 5 or 6 meters from the tents. The sound of the grass being pressed down was clear enough for all of us to hear. Mark stayed silent for a moment and then said something that made the situation even stranger. He said he couldn't see anyone. I got out of the tent at that moment because by then everyone was already on alert. Mark was standing outside holding a small flashlight he always brings when we go camping. The fog was so thick that the beam of the flashlight looked like it was hitting a white wall just a few meters away from us. The field that we had been able to see entirely before now seemed much smaller, because everything disappeared inside that fog. While I was still closing the zipper of the tent behind me, we heard the footsteps again in the grass. This time they came from the side of the campsite, as if someone were walking in a wide circle around the tents. Mark immediately pointed the flashlight toward the sound. The light illuminated a patch of wet, low grass, but there was absolutely no one there. No silhouette, no movement in the fog, nothing. Even so, a few seconds later, we heard the footsteps again, only now a little farther away, several meters beyond the reach of the flashlight. It was as if someone were walking slowly along the edge of the fog, always outside the part we could see. That started giving me a very strange feeling, because the sound was clearly there, but no one was visible. The other 2 friends who were camping with us also started coming out of their tents. Now all 4 of us were outside, staring at the same thick fog surrounding the field. Mark walked a few steps away from the center of the campsite, pointing the flashlight at the ground while trying to locate where the footsteps were coming from. The grass was wet because of the night humidity and the fog, so any movement left very clear marks on the ground. That was when he said something that made all of us move closer. There were footprints in the grass. Clear footprints, as if someone had been walking there just seconds earlier. The flashlight illuminated the marks pressing the grass down in an uneven line, exactly in the direction where we had heard the footsteps. But there was something strange about them. The footprints continued for a few meters, and then simply stopped. It wasn't like they turned in another direction. They just ended there in the middle of the field, a few meters from the edge of the fog. There was no continuation forward and no tracks going back. We all stood there looking at those marks on the ground for a few seconds without saying anything. Mark slowly walked along the footprints with the flashlight, trying to see if they reappeared farther ahead. The fog made everything feel strange because the light spread out and made it seem like the field ended only a few meters away. He walked maybe 4 or 5 steps following the tracks, and then they simply disappeared completely. The grass beyond that point was smooth, with no sign that anyone had stepped there. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Jason, who was standing a little farther back near the tents, said he had heard footsteps again. All of us turned toward the direction he pointed, and almost at the same moment the sound happened again. Slow steps on wet grass, but this time they came from another side of the campsite. It was as if someone were always walking along the edge of the fog outside the reach of the flashlight, circling the place where we were. Mark quickly turned the flashlight in that direction, but again the beam only illuminated grass and fog, nothing else. Even so, a few seconds later we saw something else on the ground. More footprints, this time starting a few meters to the right of the tents. The marks were clear in the wet grass, as if someone had just stepped there. The strange thing was that none of us had seen anyone approach that spot. It was as if the footprints simply appeared at the edge of the fog. We followed those new tracks with the flashlight just like before. They moved forward a few meters toward the campsite, stopped, and then disappeared again. There was no continuation in the grass. There were no tracks going back, just a short line of footsteps appearing and disappearing in the middle of the field. At that point, everyone was genuinely uncomfortable, because it didn't feel like someone walking normally. It felt like someone approaching up to a certain point, and then retreating back into the fog. After that, the 4 of us stayed closer to the tents. No one wanted to move too far away from the center of the campsite. Mark kept pointing the flashlight in different directions, trying to catch some movement inside the fog. But the visibility was so bad that the light barely reached a few meters. The field now felt much smaller, as if the fog had closed everything in around us. From time to time, we still heard those light footsteps on the wet grass, always coming from a different direction, always at roughly the same distance. This went on for several minutes. It wasn't constant, but it happened often enough to keep everyone tense. Sometimes we would hear 2 or 3 steps, then complete silence for a while. Then the sound would appear again on another side of the field. Every time we pointed the flashlight, no one was visible, just the wet grass and the thick fog covering everything. At one point, Jason said he was starting to think someone was walking along the edge of the field, always just outside the reach of the light. We decided not to wander around the field trying to find whatever it was. If someone really was out there, walking into the fog would only make the situation worse. So we went back closer to the tents and stayed there talking quietly, trying to understand what could be causing those footsteps. Someone mentioned it might be some large animal walking in the grass, but that didn't explain the footprints that appeared and simply stopped in the middle of the field. Besides that, the sound clearly resembled heavier footsteps spaced like those of a person walking slowly. After a while, the sound started becoming less frequent. We still heard a few isolated steps here and there, always from some different point in the fog, but with longer intervals between them. The fire had already completely gone out and the cold started getting worse. At some point close to 4 in the morning, we decided to just go back inside the tents and try to sleep a little, even though none of us felt very comfortable about it. The field was still completely covered by fog when I closed the zipper of my tent again. I eventually fell asleep for a while, but it was that light kind of sleep you get when something is still bothering you in the back of your mind. When I woke up again, it was already starting to get light outside. The morning light was coming through the tent, and when I opened the zipper, I noticed that the fog had finally begun to dissipate. The field could be seen much farther now. The grass was still wet, and the lake was visible again in the background of the landscape. For a few seconds, I looked around, trying to see if there were any footprints or any sign that someone had been there during the night. The others started coming out of their tents shortly after. The first thing we did was walk a few meters around the campsite to examine the ground in the daylight. Some of the footprints we had seen during the night were still visible in the lower grass, but since the terrain was uneven, it was difficult to follow a clear direction. That was when Mark pointed to something a few meters from the tents. There was a folding camping chair sitting there in the field, positioned facing directly toward our campsite. None of us had brought that chair. We had only 2 small chairs which were next to the fire where we had left them. That one was different, larger, and it was open as if someone had been sitting there during the night watching our tents. Story 5. I live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and from time to time I need to travel for work to smaller cities in the region. At the time this happened, I was doing consulting for a small company in Altoona, so I ended up taking a night train back because we finished everything later than I expected. The station where I got off wasn't big, one of those small rural stations that become almost empty after 10 at night. I think it was around 11:40 when the train arrived. When I got off, almost everyone had already left. Only a few passengers stepped off with me and quickly disappeared toward the parking lot. As soon as I stepped onto the platform, I noticed that the fog was very dense. It was that kind of heavy fog that covers everything and makes the lights seem dimmer. The station had a few yellow light posts, but they barely illuminated the parking lot because of the fog. My car was parked there because I had left it before traveling. It was a simple, open parking lot with a few rows of cars and a small station building behind it. I put my backpack over my shoulder and started walking toward where I remembered leaving my car. I was walking slowly because visibility was pretty bad. The fog made it difficult to distinguish the cars until you were quite close to them. The parking lot was almost empty, maybe 6 or 7 vehicles scattered across the rows. As I walked, I started hearing footsteps on the gravel on the other side of the parking lot. At first, I didn't think it was strange. I assumed it was another passenger heading to their car as well. The sound was somewhat muffled because of the fog, but it was clear enough that someone was walking. After a few seconds, I noticed something curious. The footsteps seemed to match the rhythm of mine. When I slowed down a little to look at the cars, the sound slowed down too. When I resumed walking normally, the footsteps returned as well. That made me look to the side trying to see who was there. But through the fog, all I could see were blurry silhouettes of parked cars, no person visible among them. I stopped for a moment to try to locate the sound more precisely. As soon as I stopped, the footsteps stopped too. The silence that settled over the parking lot was immediate. All I could hear was the distant sound of a car passing on the main road and a faint breeze. I stood there for a few seconds looking through the fog, trying to spot some movement between the cars. Nothing. No silhouette walking, no car door sound, nothing indicating that someone was actually there. So I started walking again. 2 or 3 steps later, I heard the same sound of footsteps on the gravel on the other side of the row of cars, in the same rhythm as mine. That started making me uncomfortable because it seemed like the person was walking parallel to me, separated only by the rows of parked vehicles. It was as if we were walking in the same direction, each of us on one side of the parking lot, but I still couldn't see anyone. I tried to rationalize it in my head. It was probably just another person going to their car, and the fog was making it hard to see clearly. Even so, I began paying closer attention to the rhythm of the footsteps. I walked a little faster. Almost immediately, the sound on the other side also became faster. It wasn't very loud, but you could clearly hear the gravel being pressed at the same pace as my steps. That made my stomach tighten a little, so I decided to test something. I suddenly stopped again in the middle of the row of cars. As soon as my footsteps stopped, the other sound stopped too. Instantly. As if the person had done exactly the same thing on the other side of the fog. I stood completely still for a few seconds, looking to the side, trying to see any movement between the parked cars. But the fog was too thick to see more than a few meters ahead. I stayed there maybe 10 seconds trying to hear breathing, some different movement, anything that confirmed someone was really there. But there was nothing. The parking lot remained silent. Then I started walking again. This time a bit faster because I was beginning to feel uneasy about the situation. 2 steps later, I heard the sound again on the other side of the row of cars. The footsteps had returned in the same rhythm. Now I was sure it wasn't a coincidence. Whoever was there was walking exactly parallel to me. I tried to look between the spaces of the cars to see a silhouette moving on the other side, but the fog hid almost everything. All I could see were the outlines of parked vehicles and the faint light from the post reflecting off the wet metal. The sound of footsteps kept accompanying me as I walked toward the part of the parking lot where my car was. At that point, I was already walking much faster. My only intention was to reach the car and leave. The parking lot seemed larger than I remembered, probably because the fog hid the ends of the rows. As I walked, the footsteps kept coming from the other side of the row of cars, always in the same rhythm as mine. It was a constant sound of gravel being pressed, sometimes slightly louder, sometimes softer, as if the person were adjusting their pace along with me. After a few seconds, I recognized my car ahead, partially covered by the fog. It was a relief to see it there. I pressed the key button in my pocket and the lights flashed twice in the silent parking lot. At that exact moment, the footsteps on the other side stopped again. The silence returned in a way that felt even heavier. I walked the last few meters quickly, opened the driver's door and got into the car without really looking back. As soon as I got inside, I automatically locked the doors and took a deep breath for a few seconds. The inside of the car was cold, but at least there I felt a little safer. Even so, the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I put the key in the ignition and started the engine. The sound felt extremely loud in that empty parking lot. Before leaving, I turned on the headlights so I could see the exit between the cars more clearly. When the headlights came on, the strong light cut through the fog in front of the car and illuminated part of the row of vehicles a few meters ahead. For a moment, the fog opened just enough for me to see clearly between 2 parked cars. That was when I saw 3 people. They were standing between the vehicles, maybe 10 or 15 meters away from my car, all of them facing directly toward me. I remember that moment clearly because it was quick, but very clear. The 3 people were completely still between 2 parked cars, roughly aligned side by side. The headlights shone directly on them. They looked like adults, but the fog and the distance made it hard to see their faces clearly. What stood out most to me was that they were all looking directly at my car. None of them were walking. None of them seemed surprised by the light. They were simply there, motionless, staring. But it lasted only a second, maybe less. As soon as the headlights fully illuminated the space between the cars, the fog closed in again at that spot. I blinked and looked back at the same place. And there was no one there, just the parked cars exactly as before. No people between them, no open doors, no movement. I didn't keep looking. I put the car in gear, left the parking lot, and drove away from there as fast as I could. To this day, I still think about the detail that bothered me the most. If there were 3 people standing there, then who was the person walking parallel to me on the other side of the parking lot while I was walking toward my car? Story 6. I live in a small coastal town in Maine called Rockland, and I fish more out of habit than for work. I have a small boat that I use to go out for a few hours in the late afternoon or very early in the morning. At that time, I used to go out alone some nights to fish near the rocky areas a little farther from the coast. It's not very far, but far enough to be outside the city lights. On the night this happened, the weather was strange. The sea was relatively calm, but the fog coming from the ocean was very thick. Even so, I decided to go out for a few hours because I was already used to those waters and knew the way back to the harbor well. It was already close to midnight when I started heading back toward the coast. The fog was even denser than when I had gone out. Visibility was so poor that the boat's lights barely illuminated a few meters ahead. The engine was low and the sound of the water hitting the hull was practically the only thing I could hear. I was navigating slowly, relying more on the GPS and my knowledge of the area than on direct visibility. Under normal conditions, you can already see the harbor lights from far away, but that night the fog swallowed almost everything. After a few minutes navigating in that direction, I started looking for the fixed harbor lights that usually appear first when you approach the city. But I still couldn't see anything. The fog was extremely thick, the kind that seems to completely block any distant light. That was when I noticed a point of light blinking ahead, near the coastline. It wasn't a strong light like the harbor lights. It was smaller, more concentrated, blinking at short intervals. My first reaction was to think it was someone with a portable spotlight, or a strong flashlight on the shore. Sometimes fishermen use lights to signal something, or someone might be trying to help guide small boats through the fog. The light blinked slowly inside the fog, always in the same spot. It seemed to be coming from somewhere near the dock, so I began aligning the boat in that direction to approach more carefully. As I moved closer, the light continued blinking at the same rhythm. It was clearly a portable spotlight or some kind of strong flashlight being directed toward the sea. That wasn't completely unusual, so at first I didn't think too much about it. I reduced the boat's speed a little more to avoid any rocks or obstacles hidden in the fog. The idea was to follow that point of light until I got close enough to recognize the dock. But after a few seconds, I noticed something strange. As the boat moved toward the light, the place where it appeared seemed to shift slightly. At first, I thought it was just the effect of the fog or the movement of the boat on the water, but the closer I got, the clearer it became that the light was actually moving a few meters to the right, deeper along the coastline. It was a slow movement, almost as if someone were walking with the spotlight in their hand. That started to confuse me a little because the place where the light was now didn't seem to be the main dock area of the town. I knew that coastline well and had a general sense of where the safe places to dock were. The main harbor had several fixed lights and structures that usually appear even through moderate fog. But that light was farther away in a part of the shoreline that is normally much darker. Even so, I kept following it for a few moments, thinking that maybe someone was signaling a specific point to avoid some shallow area. But a few seconds later, the same thing happened again. As I adjusted the boat to follow the light, it moved again inside the fog. It wasn't a fast movement. It moved slowly, several meters farther along the shore, as if someone were walking along the coastline with the light pointed toward the sea. That began to bother me because it seemed like the signal was always just a few meters farther away than it should have been. I reduced the boat's speed even more and spent a few seconds simply watching that light blinking inside the fog. The engine was almost at idle and the boat was practically gliding on the water. That was when I realized something truly didn't make sense. The direction that light was leading me toward was not the main harbor. In fact, it was a part of the coastline farther from the city, where there was practically no lighting at all. I knew that area well enough to know that. It was a more isolated part of the shoreline, sometimes used by fishing trucks or by people who park vehicles near the water during the day. At night, it's usually completely dark. While I was thinking about this, the light blinked again, and once more moved a few meters deeper into the fog as if it were calling me to keep following in that direction. That was the moment I completely stopped following that light. I was already close enough to the coast to know that direction did not lead to the city's main dock. If I kept following that spotlight, I would end up reaching a part of the shoreline where there was no proper docking structure, just a stretch of land and some areas used during the day by fishermen or pickup trucks. Besides that, I still hadn't seen any other harbor lights in that direction, which was already strange. So I slowly turned the boat to the left and began heading again toward the direction where I knew the illuminated harbor was located. A few seconds later, I finally began to see the fixed lights of the city appearing through the fog ahead. Even while I was moving away, I could still see that portable spotlight blinking inside the fog behind me. It continued blinking for a few moments, and then it simply disappeared into the mist. A few minutes later, I was finally able to line up the boat with the entrance to the harbor. The fixed dock lights began appearing more clearly as I approached, and soon the fog became a little thinner near the illuminated area of the town. Docking there was completely normal like any other night. I tied up the boat, turned off the engine, and walked to the parking lot where I keep my pickup truck. I did think for a few seconds about that light I had seen on the shore, but at that moment I just wanted to go home and sleep. The next morning I returned to the harbor early to pick up a few things I had left on the boat. The fog was gone and the sky was clear. While I was organizing my equipment, I remembered the approximate direction where that light had appeared the night before. Out of curiosity, I decided to drive a few minutes along the coastal road to that more isolated part of the shoreline. It was a dirt stretch near the water, with no lighting and no security cameras, only occasionally used by local fishermen. When I got out of the truck and walked a few meters toward the water's edge, I saw something that made me stop immediately. There were footprints in the damp sand near the shore, and fresh tire tracks in the dirt. The tracks went right up close to the water, exactly in the area where I had seen that light blinking in the fog the night before. To this day, I still think about what might have happened if I had continued following that light, instead of heading straight to the illuminated harbor.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.